What a great episode of the AT podcast this is. Our guest today is Rabbi Dr. Daniel Friedman, who's written a series of books, The Transformative Daf, and he talks about how we can read the Talmud and get into it in such a way that it's relevant, it's meaningful, it's exciting, it's fun, and plus a far-ranging bunch of other topics, including American Christian relations with Israel. I know you're going to enjoy this episode, and here we go.
Accidental Talmudist wisdom you don't want to miss. Now my pal Sal, take it away.
Welcome to the Accidental Talmudist podcast. Today, we're honored to host Rabbi Dr. Daniel Friedman. Rabbi Dr. Friedman is a renowned writer and speaker and very much a non-accidental Talmudist who has completed the Daf Yomi cycle of Talmud study, all 7.5 years of it, 4 times. I'm very honored and privileged to have him on the show. Hello, Rabbi Dr. Friedman.
Hello, Sal. Well, I have to say, I think I'm actually here by accident. I thought I was coming to a Kabbalah podcast. No, it's an honor. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here on the Accidental Talmudist. I'm a big fan of yours, Sal. You are someone who has taken the Talmud and brought it to so many people, and you're an inspiration to us all. So thank you for having me here today, Sal.
Thank you very much for that. And I think Rabbi Dr. Friedman, it's all a little too much. How about Rav Daniel? Is that going to be okay?
Let's run with it.
All right, very good. All right, so Rav Daniel, my story is somewhat well known. How I happened to buy book 1 of the Talmud on day 1 of the Daf Yomi cycle that commenced in 2005. A coincidence far too weird to be a coincidence. Hashem clearly arranged it. But Hashem arranges everything. And so what was your encounter with the Talmud and how did you end up on this track?
So I love your story. I love your story. And I do repeat the story to people because a lot of people are afraid of opening up the Talmud, opening up any of our Jewish books, and even people who have been engaged and born into it sometimes feel this fear of taking it to the next level or teaching it on the next level. And your story is just truly something really special. But I've been learning Talmud since I was 9 years old in Yeshiva Day School in Sydney, Australia. And it's something that I did as part of the Yeshiva Day School system and the Yeshiva system. And you do it and you do it and you do it. And then one day you wake up and you say, but so what? Who cares? What difference does this make? And what difference does this make to my life as a Jewish person? So I will say this, already before that awakening, I was already someone who loved learning the Talmud. I mean to say that there are some people, and part of the yeshiva system is you take a portion of the Talmud and you spend a lot of time on it. So you can take one page, as opposed to the Daf Yomi, you can take one page and you can spend days or even weeks on it. That didn't really ever speak to me. And so I had this tacit agreement with my Rosh Yeshiva from a young age where I would just cover ground. And before I knew it, I was doing Daf Yomi, and that's why I'm on my 4th cycle now, because it was just something that spoke to me. But then you're doing it, and you say, so what? So I have all this information. What does it mean? How is it changing my life? How is it affecting me as a spiritual person, as a Jewish person? What's my connection to heaven? And I committed at that moment, this was already a number of years later when I was a pulpit rabbi in Edmonton, Canada. I said to myself, so what does it mean? And if I need some meaning out of it, then surely everyone else does, my congregants do. And so I committed that every day I would find something that was relevant, transformative, and meaningful to my day-to-day life. And I started teaching it at my synagogue, at Beth Israel Synagogue in Edmonton. Then I started blogging it. The blog had a number of iterations. It began as, it was called lifeyomi.com. Then it was known as dafyo.me, so .me. What does the daf mean to me? And then I was blogging on the Times of Israel until eventually, about 8-10 months ago, somebody approached me, somebody who I'd met a couple of years ago, who said to me, you know what, it's time to take this to the next level. Let's publish this. And it's now being published through Mosaic Press, called the Transformative Daf.
Right. I'm holding one of the volumes in my hand right here, the Transformative Daf on Tractate Megillah, which is what we're studying right now in the Daf Yomi cycle. And just for people who are not familiar with that term, Daf Yomi means page of the day. And so we read one page a day for 7.5 years. And that's what it takes to read the entire Talmud. I love what you're saying about it's almost like, let's get Talmudic on what you've said and drill in a little bit on these terms. I mean, the word transformative, I think, is very important. Any kind of spiritual journey that doesn't change the person on that journey is probably not really a spiritual journey. So you were looking for a kind of transformative attribute to your study from a young age. What does the word transformative mean to you?
Say, Sal, I think that every moment, every day needs to be filled with growth. And one of the things about learning Talmud every day is that you're always making sure that you're at least staying in the same spot. What do I mean? Well, think about what you learned yesterday. You probably remember it pretty well. Think about what you learned a year ago or 5 years ago. Not so much. You don't remember it as well because it was a while ago. In other words, every day, as every day passes, we are losing information. We're losing what we learned in the past. So every day that we don't learn something new, we're falling in terms of our knowledge. And so if we want to be able to just keep up, then we need to constantly be learning on a yomi, on a daily basis. And that's what makes Daf Yomi or other daily learning schedules so beautiful, so precious, and so vital. So when we say transformative, it seems like I am being active, but really simply to learn on a daily basis is just keeping myself static. Now, transformative means learning, going that little bit extra, going the extra mile to be able to change who I was from today to who I am to right now, going forward, tomorrow, the next day. If I've learned a little bit extra, I've transformed myself, I've made myself a better person, a more spiritual person, a more knowledgeable person, a wiser person, and somebody who has taken these steps to take my soul on that journey a little bit further.
Right. And not every day of Daf Yomi naturally lends itself to that kind of personal spiritual growth. Yesterday's Daf, and I haven't taught today's class yet, but yesterday was exactly about this. I'm a day behind in teaching my class. So that was page 27 in Tractate Megillah, page 28 in Tractate Megillah, which is where a bunch of sages answered the question, to what do you ascribe your long life? And they talked about being meticulous with certain interpersonal qualities, like never, building themselves up at the expense of another person, not going to bed angry. I mean, these are kinds of wisdom teachings that sound like wisdom teachings that should be transformative. Other days, other tractates, the technicalities of the law of an Erev, or, which particular relatives are obligated to marry or not marry. It can get very technical. And then it's a bigger challenge to unearth that spiritual lesson.
So that's true. But I want to just fine tune what you've said and think about our current place of learning. So the last couple of days, Daf 27, Daf 28, those disciples were asking their teachers, in what merit did you gain longevity in your life? And you're right, Sal, these are wisdom teachings, but they seem almost so obvious and mundane that we're tempted to just read through them and say, oh, that makes sense, without thinking, well, what do they really mean? So even within those straightforward teachings, I think that sometimes we need to dissect it. I'll give you an example. Rabbi Preda on page 27, his disciples ask him, what's your secret to long life? And he says, well, I was always the first in the base medrash. I was the first in shul, in the study hall every morning. And I never led the services or benched before a Kohen. And I always made sure to eat of an animal sacrifice I always made sure that I wouldn't partake of any food without the elevation before it. So
And the
those
parts
three
removed
things,
for the benefit of the Cohen, for the priest.
right? So if you look at it literally, it actually doesn't say that. Right? So you're right, Sal, that the commentators tell us that that's the meaning, and that's why I was trying to choose my words wisely, because yes, the interpretation is that I wouldn't eat it before the parts were given to the Kohen, but really it says I wouldn't eat it before its gifts were elevated. Right now the words are coming back to me. So I say to myself, well, doesn't that mean he wouldn't eat it if it's not kosher? I mean, if the tithes aren't given, that means it's not kosher. So what's really happening here? What's he really saying? And I think the three of them are a package. So he says it's always first to get to Shul each morning, but he's never going to get himself there before other people who need to be there. What do I mean? Sometimes people want to rush to be somewhere and elbow everybody else out of the way. Let's say, for example, leading services. Right? He wants to be the one to lead services. Maybe it's in memory of a dearly beloved, departed loved one. But there are three others. And other people also want to be. Oh, he was there first. No. He says, I always said, well, wait a sec. I want to be first, but I want to also think about who else I should be taking into account. And then every time he sat down to eat, he made sure that the food was elevated. He said to himself, I'm not just going to eat just to quickly eat through this and get on with my day. No, I have to think, why am I eating? What's the purpose of this food? I need it to be able to give me energy to serve God. I need to make sure that this piece of food is elevated. In other words, he acted with alacrity, but without impetuousness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's the package that sometimes we can read through very quickly without thinking, oh, wait a sec, well, what are the different parts of what Rabbi Preda is saying here? But you're right. I mean, there are parts of the Talmud that are more challenging in terms of figuring out what it is, what does it mean to me, what's the practical application. I sincerely believe that every letter, every word, every page has to have meaning. Otherwise, God wouldn't have placed the Torah here in this world to be able to give us a life in this world. We could have been angels. The fact that we are here in this world and learning the Talmud right here, right now, means it needs to have an application for my life right here, right now.
I mean, 100%. And I think one thing, and you were talking about it as you were talking about growing up and attending a yeshiva, and we who didn't have the privilege to attend the yeshiva and kind of are finding our own way back as adults, sometimes think, well, I mean, those guys that learned in yeshiva, in addition to learning so much and having this wonderful foundation in scripture and all the various layers of scripture, they also have this great ahavas Hashem. They have this great love of God. It must have been taught to them, in some kind of deep and elaborate way. And then I meet all these guys from yeshiva and say, not necessarily. That may not necessarily be something that we talked about. And to me, it's so important. It's so vital. I mean, it's just, God says you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul. And we repeat that every morning and every evening, at least those 2 times. But then how do we actually enact that? How do we love God and come closer to God through our study? And that has to be part of the transformative nature of any study that I think you're talking about.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think you make a great point. I think that there have been turning points in the history of our tradition and our pedagogy where our leaders have said, well, wait a second, there is a disconnect here. A couple of those turning points are the beginning of the Hasidic movement, where the Baal Shem Tov says, people need more. They're lacking that spirit of the Lord, that spirituality. Why are they learning the Talmud, for example, in such a disconnected mode of engagement. They're learning a cold fact law, and it's not doing anything to them internally. And there's a response to that happens as well in the non-Hasidic world with the rise of the Musar movement. So Rabbi Yisrael Salanter and others. So what then happens over the last century and a half is that yeshivas across the board kind of start changing their curriculum to adopt those ideas and say, well, we need to start thinking about relationships with God, spirituality within as a separate category almost within religion and how it relates to it. And I think we're almost hitting a turning point right now over the last few years in our generation, a new turning point, a deepening of that, where the yeshivas are seeing that there are those that are not making it because we're not speaking about these things enough and we're not connecting the dots enough. And I hope that my little contribution can be something towards that new approach where we say, okay, not everybody's going to be able to learn simply for learning's sake, although that's the ideal. We believe that learning whatever Torah you're learning is connecting with the will of the Almighty. But some people are going to need a little more practical application, myself included, and we need to give that to them. And let's try and figure out what it is, how we connect those dots to keep everybody as engaged as possible. Because we're living in an age that it's not easy to be engaged with anything. We're being hit from all sides with all sorts of ideas, and people don't have long attention spans. And unless we can get them with something that's going to engage with them, then we're going to lose them. Yeah,
so much so. And again, it's funny, no coincidences. I mean, what we're learning about right now in Tractate Megillah is the laws of synagogues and the importance of synagogues and the fact that we're creating a sacred space. And what does it mean that we have a sacred space? And, questions like this have never been more relevant in the Jewish world coming, who knows, maybe it's the end of COVID, God forbid, it's the middle of COVID. Who knows where this is all headed. But you're a congregational rabbi. I mean, in the Orthodox world, things, largely back to normal, but there's been a lot of backyard minyanim that have been very successful. People have enjoyed praying together in backyards and in living rooms, and sometimes they're not so quick to go back to the synagogues. And in the non-Orthodox world, where there's been these Zoom services, even on Shabbos, it's becoming a terrific problem now. Sort of re-energizing in person, praying together, learning together. And our sages, long before there was Zoom or COVID, we're talking about these spaces, what it means when people come together, the glory of the synagogue in Alexandria, as you're talking about in in book Transformative Daf on page 29. And that it was a wonderful, wonderful, massive, beautiful synagogue where the people sat by profession, and that it was a wonderful club in a sense where they could network with people of their profession at shul. Now, as the gabbai of my little backyard meeting, who's always dealing with the talkers, the yackers during services, I'm thinking, oh God, they're talking business. If they're not talking business, they're just friendly and making l'chaims, but they're not paying attention to the davening, the praying, and the Torah reading. And again, balancing these competing interests of making sacred space sacred and making it, a friendly and community place. These are not new issues.
Right. Yeah, but I think absolutely the model of the synagogue in Alexandria, where people were divided according to profession, really shows us that synagogues were more than just a place to pray. They were places for community. The word Beit Knesset means a house of gathering. A synagogue is a house of gathering, not just a house of prayer. And we lose that when we think that, well, we can pray at home, or we can pray next door, we can pray in the garden. When we're praying together in a community and in a bigger community, because also this is not something that just began with COVID. It's something that has happened over the last couple of decades. In Orthodoxy, it was dubbed the stabilization of Orthodoxy. In the conservative movement, it was dubbed the Chavura issue, where people felt that we don't need to go to an established shul anymore. We can just pray in small groups, but something is lost there when we're not men, women, children, youth services, chesed activities, being there for the ill and infirm and elderly. These are all the aspects that go into what a community is, and this is something special. And please God, we will be able to bring that back very soon, back to its former glory. And maybe this is just a dip to remind us really what we were missing, where we were going, and why we need to come back to where we were, decades ago.
Yeah, please God. I'll just mention that something I say to my audience often, because I think it's so important. We said before the commandment that thou shalt love the Lord thy God. You love your wife, right?
Yeah.
Now, when we say, well, how do you love God? How do you show your love to God? And we talk about putting God first and submitting, sublimating our desires and, sort of walking the straight and narrow as a show of affection to God, showing up to services, study, tithing for the poor as another way to show love of God, doing chesed, loving kindness projects, etc. But if you did all these things around the house, and you were a really, really good husband and showed your wife how you love her by all of your activities, but you never said to her, I love you, something would be missing. And so I say to people, one of the easiest ways to show that you love God is to say, I love you, God. Spend some time every day and say it with your lips. I love you, God. It's a great way to start a conversation. God is the strong silent type. Sure that he appreciates hearing us say. And once you're talking, now you've opened the conversation a little bit, like Rabbi Nachman says, talk to God like your good friend. Once you say I love you, you're going to be saying, and some of the reasons I love you are, and I'm so grateful for. And it leads to all kinds of wonderful things. But I find it absolutely transformative to say, I love you, God.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the, I'm just going to take that, your idea, just broaden it a touch. One of the classic line that there are no atheists in the trenches. I often turn to people who say, well, they pray when something goes wrong. And I say, well, what do you pray? Well, I pray that God should save me from this situation, whether it's a health scare, it's an issue at work, or it's an issue in relationships. And I say, well, wait a sec. That's actually not the definition of Jewish prayer. Jewish prayer, as we know, has three elements. Element number one is exactly what you're saying, Sal. First of all, you have to say to God, I love you, God. God, you're awesome. God, these are all the fabulous things you do. Only then, once you praise God, at that point, then you can start asking God for what you want. You have to develop the relationship first, then do the ask, and then thank him. Three elements: praise, beseech, thanks. So absolutely, Sal, spot on. I mean, we have to have that relationship. We have to tell God how appreciative we are already and how wonderful he is. And then we can start asking for what we need.
And to the one who might say, okay, well, that I get. I'm into that kind of spirituality, having a personal relationship with God. How is the Talmud about furthering that relationship?
Yes, that's a great question. But I believe every little piece teaches us. Every little piece. I remember a story. I haven't repeated this story, and I hope it comes out right, from many, many years ago. I had a friend in high school. I went to Sydney Boys High School. It was an all-boys public school selective that we had out of 180 boys in the year, 30 were Jewish. 5 of us wore yarmulkes. So, it was a place that Jews went and Jews were accepted. Observant Jews went. And one of my friends in high school at one point went a little arrived from his Judaism, and his father sent him off to Nei Yisrael Yeshiva for a while in Baltimore, in Maryland, and
literally around the world.
right, and he was taught over there, well, if you learn Talmud, you will be able to restore your faith. And at the time, I didn't understand. I thought this makes no sense. You learn Talmud, you will restore your faith. I mean, what's the connection? An ox falls into a pit, and what's that? What does that have to do with restoring faith? But when you study the Talmud, when you learn the Talmud, and you look at how each word is just brilliantly measured, and you start to say, well, this must be God's work. I mean, it sounds like a bunch of rabbis arguing, but then all the pieces fall into place like the work of the can't be, like the written law, it's just not feasibly just the work of human hands. It's something that's been divinely inspired and put together. And you're like, wow, I remember that aha moment I had while learning in Yeshiva in Israel, where everything just fell into place. And it might have been laws about an ox falling into a pit. It didn't matter what it was. It was just the magic of what happens in the Talmud. And then it was only then that I said to myself, okay, now that I have this magic, now how do I share it? How do I bring that magic to others? But there was something that was happening that was greater than what met the eye.
Yeah. I had that same sense on those days or weeks or even months. They're literally months when you're in the very heavy kind of technical type of learning, where it on the surface, it doesn't feel so spiritual. But I was always struck by, thinking that project that our sages had to unearth God's will in just every aspect of life and of human life. Like, how does God want us to approach this situation? How does God want us to live? How does God want us to work out this problem? And the passion of our sages to dig and to dig and to dig and to dig and to argue with each other and to work at it, not just for years or decades, but for generations. It was a generations long project, one that of course is still going on today, but particularly in the times of the mission, in the times of the Gemara, just to figure out God's will in that very organized and not always so organized way. It's a passion. I was really struck by that passion.
Right. And I think when you say unorganized, something that one of the things that struck me that I think that we forgot for a number of centuries, and now we're recalling, is let's call it chaos. It's not really chaos. It's really storytelling. Our whole religion is based on this storytelling. You open up, to begin with, the Torah itself, the Bible. You open up the Bible, and it seems like it's a bunch of stories, and it seems like, so who cares? There are these stories. But the way that God has conveyed his message to us is in a way that we can relate to. It doesn't just speak to our mind, it speaks to our emotions. And that's why it's told in the way of stories. I mean, we know now, thousands of years later, so modern science of conveying message, TED Talks are all about storytelling. Now we've figured it out, but the Bible knew that thousands of years ago. The Talmud knew that thousands of years ago. In order to be able to create that mnemonic that people should remember, because recall, the Talmud in the beginning wasn't written down. This was all something that people just knew and remembered and spoke and taught and learned it 101 times to be able to drill it down. You had to have it in a way that was stories so that it flowed. There had to be a flow of memory. And then we got to a medieval period where we said, okay, so we've got all the Talmud now, so what are the laws? Let's codify the laws. Let's pick out the laws and just lay the laws all out. And I'm not criticizing this. I mean, this is how we know what to do, because the Talmud is a huge corpus, and to be able to take all the laws out of that is very difficult. And so we had codifiers who said, okay, let's just lay it all out, and that way we'll know what to do. And that's what happened. That was the style for a few centuries, until we came back to a moment where we said, well, there's something that's lost there, where we don't have the fillers between the lines, those stories that are pulling it all together and making it exciting and invigorating. And that's really what the Talmud is, because even in those parts of the Talmud that seem to be bogged down and weighed down in details, the Talmud will drift away to keep us excited and engaged. And okay, all right, we get a page or two of stories. Okay, let's go back to it now, because now we need to be able to focus on remembering that we are a law-based religion, that God connects to us through the law, but we're going to be able to put some way of engagement in to be able to keep us going through those laws, which are essential.
Yeah. And with drama and with humor, you know, I mean, some of these phrases that they use, you know, could it enter your mind to believe that the great Rama would say? Certainly not, you know. And there was an incident in which, you know, and the maidservant of Rabbi Gamliel knew more than all the sages of her generation, et cetera. It's wonderful. It's very emotional, and therefore makes an impact in a way that simply codified laws would not.
Right. And that's why I feel that. Sorry, I was just saying, that's why it almost feels like what I'm doing is superfluous if we really understood what the Talmud had to offer. We don't, because we're that little bit further removed from the conversation that the rabbis were having 1,500 years ago in the Talmud. And so what happens is we need more fillers, which are what the commentaries do over the years, is they help us. You know, we think about the fillers that the Midrash does to the Torah, right? It's not necessary, but for that generation, the rabbis got up and they said, okay, let's fill in some more parts of the story to be able to keep the people engaged and on the page and excited. And so if I can, as I say, do that little bit, you know, hopefully I'm helping the long-term plan.
Well, you're certainly helping a lot. It's a beautiful work that you've put together. You're writing it now, and you know, you've made this journey 4 times. Let me ask you, how have your journeys through the entire Talmud differed from each other?
I think that, I mean, obviously I've matured as a person and my understanding has matured. You know, one learns differently. I even look back at what I'm preparing now for the published version is based on my blog from 7 years ago. And it's my thought process has matured. In some cases, I go back to the drawing board. In other cases, I refine what I've done. Because if one is constantly learning, then one should constantly be improving, not just in terms of knowledge, but in terms of the way one thinks. And I would like to think that every time that I approach the Talmud, I'm getting a deeper insight than the previous time.
Let me ask you a little bit about your process, just as your fellow writer. You know, like what is your writing schedule? How do you create at this point?
So when I learn, I look for hot button issues. So I'm looking through the daf, I'm learning the daf, and waiting for that moment when I say, whoa, I might have learned that before, you know, last time round or the time before, but that, whoa, I don't know why I never noticed that little detail that jumps out at me. And I say, well, the Gemara didn't need to say that. The Gemara didn't need to give me that detail. The Gemara didn't need to give me that case. I mean, I'm preparing at the moment. I'm working in Tractate Nedarim, and on page 4, I had an issue of somebody who made a vow to be a Nazir, a Nazirite, that they would let their hair grow and stop drinking wine. And the Gemara says, well, he must have made that vow in a cemetery. I said, what? Stop.
How did you take that leap?
No. So it's the Gemara needed to create a scenario to be able to solve an issue. But I say to myself, okay, I picture it. There's a fellow standing in a cemetery making a vow of Nazirism. What's going on inside his head? Why is that happening? And so I go on to explain, well, there's a certain moment that happens when you're dealing with life and death situations when you make that vow of abstinence and say, I want to turn my life around. That wasn't the Gemara's point, the way we read it literally. The Gemara's point literally was the Gemara wanted to give me an example of how a person might make a vow and not be able to fulfill it immediately just because of his environment. But to me, I say there's something more going on, because there could have been other examples. The fact that the Gemara gives that example means, what are the rabbis trying to tell me? What should I be thinking about this? So as I learn through that page of the Talmud, I'm finding the Gemara's solutions and not just accepting them and saying, okay, you know what, okay, good solution, seems a little far-fetched, but okay, whatever. Because that's our approach to the solutions of the scenarios in the Talmud, but it is far-fetched unless we take it to the next level and say, well, what else might it mean other than what I'm reading right now? And so I take these problematic issues. Sometimes my challenge to myself is to take the most difficult issue, theological, philosophical, ideological, or in terms of our modern sensibility, the kind of things that most of us, even contemporary Haredi, Daf Yomi, sheer givers would kind of just mumble away because you were kind of embarrassed about certain things that have been. No. I don't stand for any of that. I say the Torah is an eternal document. The Gemara is an eternal document. If we don't understand it, it's a deficiency in us. It's not deficiency in the page. It's not deficiency in all the rabbis were just working in their archaic ways of thinking. No. God forbid. God forbid. This is our oral law for all eternity. If we are failing to picture it and internalize it and thinking that it doesn't make sense, then figure it out. And that's what I'm trying to do. I almost feel like sometimes, and I don't want to sound arrogant with this, but I feel like I'm advocating for the Talmud. I feel like, where others would say, the Talmud is a document that is patriarchal and archaic. And I say, no. We're just not getting it. Let me figure out how to get this, how to make it meaningful and understandable and comprehensible to a person, male, female, Jew, non-Jew in the 21st century.
Yes, and thank God you're doing that. It shouldn't need doing, but it does. And I absolutely agree with you that if we're not getting sparked by it, we should slow down. We should examine where we're coming from, where the daf is coming from, what's really going on here. And I love that idea of trying, like the Nazir in the cemetery, trying to picture a situation and almost like a filmmaker. I mean, I am a filmmaker, but bring it to life in your mind and say, well, imagine real people in a real situation asking themselves these questions, or going to the rabbi and asking these questions, and what emotions would then be at stake. And then the questions can suddenly take on a whole new life, that is fruitful and transformative. All right, let's switch gears a little bit.
Just before you do, you are a filmmaker. I want to tell you, in Edmonton, we showed your film one night, Slichas night, before we began. And I wanted to engage with people. And it seemed like it was so out of place at that moment. But I wanted to wake people up. And I think that it's that moment that we used it as a discussion point. It had nothing to do with Slichas, but it got people in the room. And I said, now let's think about our Judaism. We're about to face the high holidays. And it got people thinking. And sometimes we need those triggers in a good way to be able to wake people up and think, what does my Judaism mean to me? So thank you for that.
Oh, you're very welcome. I assume you're talking about our movie, When Do We Eat?
Yes.
Which is about a kind of wild and crazy, but ultimately spiritually transformative Passover Seder. And you were bringing it out during Slichas in the preparation for Rosh Hashanah.
Yes.
But of course, these holidays are very closely related, and there's a lot going on that we can learn, from one to the other every year. So you mentioned to me before we started tonight that you had just recently become Rabbi Doctor Daniel Friedman. So you've completed your doctorate, but it's not in rabbinical studies. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
So my doctorate is in international relations. I have written a dissertation on American Christian attitudes to Israel. And I have to say, it comes from the same place. My entire existence, what I wake up with every morning, every day, is I ask myself, what's the most important thing I can be doing today? If I open a page of the Talmud, I want to be able to know, why am I doing this? Who cares? So what? How is it going to make a difference in my life? And so when I approach my academic work as well, I say to myself the same thing. What's the most important thing I can be studying, I can be investigating, the most pressing problem, the biggest issue today that makes a difference, that I need to know more about? And that's what got me into studying the relationship between Christians and Israel. I sincerely believe, I think I know, that the state of Israel, at least as far as we can see here in this world, would not exist today without the contribution of some major Christian historic figures, like the likes of Lord Balfour, the likes of President Woodrow Wilson, the President Harry Truman, and many others, theologians as well, the likes of John Nelson Darby, many Christians who have made Israel a reality today. And when I started learning about them, reading their stories, I said, I need to know more. And so what I have studied over the last, it's taken me 13 years, so almost as long as my multiple times that I've been doing, yes, two Daf Yomi cycles to get this doctorate, I said to myself, what is it? What's the Christian contribution? Just to give you this one, during former President Trump's administration, the embassy was moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the U.S. embassy, and it really had nothing to do with Jews. American Jews were either ambivalent or unsure about the move. He did it for his Christian constituency. There's a folklore that says that Christians went around saying that finally we put the USA back in Jerusalem.
Never heard that. That's good.
So, but this is something that was primarily driven by Christians. This is the Holy Land for Christians and Jews, and this is something that, and Israel is important to many Christians, and it's something that's developed over many centuries. And at the same time, though, Israel's also an issue for many Christians who don't necessarily believe in a Jewish restoration to Israel, because Christianity superseded Judaism. And so what I look at is both those Christians who are very supportive of Israel and those Christians who are not as supportive of Israel. And I look at the theology and politics behind the movements and the connections between the various streams amongst American Christian groups as to why they are supporting either side in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Fascinating. I mean, it's really beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, but I'd love to have many more talks with you about this subject. I'm sharing, the tradition, what's beautiful in Judaism. I teach the Talmud class every day, but we also have, an article, The Table for Five, where we share 5 commentaries on a verse from the weekly Torah portion, and stories of heroes, both Jewish heroes and non-Jews, often Christians who saved Jews during the Holocaust, a variety of kinds of content, through social media, primarily Facebook, and our audience is quite large, and probably more than half are not Jewish. and they're very curious about our tradition. A lot of them are Christians who are, very aware that Jesus was Jewish and lived as a Jew and was probably a pretty learned Jew. In fact, you read in some of his words like it's straight from the Gemara.
Yes.
We recently had, by the measure with which you measure others, so you are measured. So I didn't know. I mean, I'm not familiar with the New Testament, but that line is almost verbatim, and it follows right after "Judge not, lest ye be judged." That's a very famous line. But the next verse in their Bible sounds like it came right from the Talmud.
Well, understand, of course. I mean, at that time, it was all oral teachings. The Talmud wasn't even recorded yet at that point. And so these were oral teachings that Jesus would have been very familiar with, because this was the spirit of the written law that all Jews live by.
Yeah. In terms of the other group who are, not so pro-Israel, not so Zionist, I just don't interact with them very much. Occasionally we get trolled. Some of them speak up from time to time. But by far, it's that former group that is interacting with us at Accidental Talmudists, and it's a very warm and collegial relationship. In our daily class, we have a guy, Bill, he's just terrific. He's a doctoral student, in Christian theology. I don't know what his particular focus is, but he's so learned in the history. The geopolitical history of Israel around that time, and often adds, beautiful context to sort of, Jewish-Roman relations, Judeo, Greek relations, Egyptian relations at that time. It's fascinating. It's wonderful to be learning together and making those bridges.
Right. No, absolutely. We need all the friends that we can get. And it's something that, we learned it recently in Tractate Rosh Hashanah in the Talmud, where the rabbis said, what do we do to get rid of these Roman decrees? And they went to a Roman noblewoman, and she says, well, you have to engage with political advocacy. You have to stand in the street and hold up the banners and say, what about human rights? We're all brothers and sisters. And they did that, and the decrees were annulled. And you think back to 2 generations earlier, the time of Rabbi Akiva, who said, I'm just going to defy the government. And unfortunately, it didn't end well. But when we learned how to engage with those around us, and we learned how to play the game, we can. No man is an island, no country is an island, and we, as a Jewish people, have been placed here in the world. Israel has been placed in the world to be able to interact, to be a light into the nations, but at the same time to be able to work on an even playing field and give just as much as we take and give, and be part of that brotherly humankind bond.
Yeah. And we see over and over again how God knows there's anti-Semitism in the world. I mean, God probably creates anti-Semitism in the world. It's one of those attributes of the world that has purpose. I mean, perhaps it's one of the forces that keeps us together as a people over time. But there's also, a lot of philo-Semitism. And it's so interesting that this idea that, the Jews had when they assimilated into American culture in previous centuries, that, if we just look like everybody else and act like everybody else, then we'll be fine. They'll leave us alone, does not garner the respect of our neighbors and peers. Whereas being, Jews who are loud and proud, Jewy Jews earn a lot more respect in the cultures in which we live.
Yeah, no, this America is a real blessing.
I see that you're the inaugural chair of the National Holocaust Monument of Canada. So, the subject of the Holocaust, which is never far from Jewish conversations, is one that you're also engaged in, which tell us a little bit about that work.
So I lived in Canada for 16 years, and this is a brilliant story. When we talk about our friends beyond the Jewish community. So there's a quirky law in Canada where if you want to introduce a new piece of legislation, something that hasn't been discussed until now. Each person gets one chance. You have to ask a rookie backbencher to introduce this new piece of legislation. So at the time, the government wanted it introduced, and they went to a new member of parliament by the name Tim Uppel. And they said, Mr. Uppel, would you like to be the one to introduce the legislation about the Holocaust monument? And Uppel went home and spoke to his wife and came back and said, yes, I'll do it. He brought it to the parliament. It passed unanimously to establish a Holocaust monument in the capital. And it was actually a little peculiar that Canada did not have a national Holocaust monument until 2017. Here's the clincher. Here's what I didn't tell you, the little pieces of the story. You see, Tim Uppel is Sikh. Sikh are those people who wear turbans. He's never cut his hair, he's never cut his beard. His wife, so I mentioned he went home and spoke to his wife. You see, his wife, Kiran, she is also Sikh. She went to a Catholic school, and in her Catholic school, she had Jewish friends. And these Jewish friends in high school said to her, we're going on the March of the Living. I wonder if you can come along. And they asked, and the organizers of the March of the Living said, sure. So the March of the Living, as you know, Sal, is where they take teenagers to visit the death camps and the concentration camps, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and others. And they said to this Sikh girl at the Catholic school, would you like to come? She says, yeah, so yes. She went along with them. From that moment on, she maintained her relationship with what she calls, unfortunately, he passed just a few months ago, Rabbi Reuven Bulka of Ottawa. She would call him her rabbi, the Sikh girl who went to a Catholic school. And listen to the way the Almighty works. Why did that all happen? So that some 20 years later, when her husband, her Sikh husband, would be handed, she would say, no brainer. Of course, this is your historic moment. This is your moment that you are going to be the initiator of this legislation. Where do I come into the mix? So Tim Uppel comes back to Sherwood Park, which is a town outside of Edmonton. Not maybe a handful of Jews in Sherwood Park, no synagogue in Sherwood Park. And to no fanfare, because nobody in Sherwood Park probably even knows that he did this. But I hear about this in Edmonton. I say, whoa, somebody has to say something about this. And I call up his office and I say, would Mr. Uppel agree to joining us at synagogue for services, would like to put on a kiddush in his honor? He is completely touched. He shows up, he speaks. He and I become best of friends over the years. He recommends me to be part of the council to establish this monument. I become the chair of the council. Tim Uppel has spoken, the Sikh fellow with a turban, at my daughter's bat mitzvah and presented to her from the government at my daughter's bat mitzvah. Tim Uppel is one of the Chasidei Umos Ha'olam, the righteous Gentiles. And this is how I got involved in the National Holocaust Monument of Canada through Tim Uppel and his Sikh wife who went to Catholic school with Jewish friends.
What a beautiful story. I just love it. God is so, in addition to all his other amazing qualities, he's got this elegance to him, he's got all the moves in play, all the chess pieces are always in play.
Oh yeah.
You don't see what the strategy was until decades later. Wonderful. Now, where are we speaking with you today, Rav Daniel? Where are you?
So I'm currently living in the Teaneck area in New Jersey, actually in New Milford, just outside of Teaneck. I am taking a sabbatical year to do some writing. I just finished off my PhD and I'm writing the Transformative draft. Mm-hmm. I mentioned that it's not just Teaneck, it is New Milford because just this past Hanukkah, I lit the menorah at the New Milford Town Hall. How did that happen? I'm driving along and I see a banner across the street, and the banner says Winter Wonderland and tree lighting. And in the corner of this banner, there is a menorah. I'm like, okay, I mean, I don't think there's any synagogue in New Milford. There are Jews that live in New Milford because it borders Teaneck. So I wander into the town hall. I says, I saw a little menorah. Is there menorah lighting? Yeah, we do menorah lighting. I says, who lights the menorah? I don't know. So I introduced myself. I said, I'm new to the area. My name is Rabbi Daniel Friedman. 3 hours later, I get a call. Hi, this is Mayor Michael Petrino. Rabbi Friedman, we'd be honored if you would light the menorah for us. So I'm
right
the
place,
rabbi
right time.
Yeah, I'm the rabbi of New Milford, New Jersey. A rabbi without synagogue currently.
The chief rabbi. You're the chief
That's
rabbi
it.
of New Milford. Oh, very good. Listen, it's really been a delight to have you on the AT podcast today, Rev Daniel. Do you have any parting thoughts that you'd like to leave with our audience?
Well, thank you, Sal. Thank you for having me. You do an incredible job. You're an inspiration to us all. And my message to your viewers, your listeners, is just make every day as meaningful, relevant, purposeful, and transformative as possible. Wishing everybody a transformative day.
Amen. Amen. Thank you for appearing. And I look forward to learning from you, perhaps in person one day, but certainly through your books in the meantime. All the
Thank you.
best.